So question number 25 is very straightforward. What I would recommend that you do with the question, if you ever get something like this, is type it into your calculator, look at the table of values, and plot all the points that you possibly can. Some of you also might recognize that this equation here is the parent function of the square root of x shifted down one space. But either way, you need to make sure that you have points on your graph. You can't just draw a random line or a curve across the graph. We need to see key features and also the arrow at the end and the starting point are all very important. So if you drew it just like this, you could earn the full 2 points. The very first thing that we need to recognize about question number 26 is that this is an exponential function. It's one of the 3 main functions that we talk about in algebra. We know this because there is a variable in the power. I'm hoping that all of you are thinking right now, make a graph. Look at its picture, look at its table, because one of the main things that we talk about in Common Core Algebra is making the connection between the equation, the graph, and the table. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we have the graph and the table. A couple of things that I want to point out. I'm hoping that you changed your window because when I graphed it, it did not look like this. So I tried to get some of the key points on my graph, such as the y-intercept, and I also wanted to look at the table for all of my positive values of x, because if you look up here, we know that t is in years. So it would be silly to think about negative years. Okay, so now what? Okay, I have a graph. At least we can now see that our graph is decreasing, which makes sense because up above here it says there's a breakdown of a sample. So the sample is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, yeah, that makes sense because the graph is decreasing. Looking at the table, let's check out these y values. Are they getting smaller as x's get bigger? Well, they sure are. Now, what we need to identify is how. How are they decreasing? How does 300 become 150? And how does 150 become 75? And how does 75 become 37.5? If you said that we are multiplying by 1/2 or dividing by 2, you are correct. Because to get from 300 to 150, we multiplied by 1/2. To get 150 to become 75, half of that again, and so on and so forth. So as we're working downwards through our y values, we can see that we are taking half of the substance from the year before. Our job now is to translate this into words because it's asking us up above here, tell me what 0.5 and 300 actually mean. Okay, 300 is the initial amount of the substance in milligrams. We can see that because it's our y-intercept. It's how we're starting. And always that number out in front is the initial value. Okay, that's another way to remember this. And the second part, the 0.5 or 1/2 means that every year the substance breaks down by half. That's what we were looking at in our table of values for y. At first glance, question number 27 looks really scary. If we look at this inequality here, there's 2 variables, and we haven't really done much work with 2 variables. But if you continue reading and calm down a little bit, you can realize that this is a very simple inequality that needs to be solved. Now, this is one way of doing it. I agree. Yes, there's other ways that we could answer this question and still receive full credit, but I'm going to go back to my algebra roots. All right. This problem wants us to figure out what the largest integer value of a is. And it also tells us that x is equal to -1. So immediately, if x is equal to -1, I'm going to substitute and use parentheses. And after we distribute, we have a couple simple multiplication questions that I'm just going to condense to make it look a little bit cleaner. So hopefully now we can kind of see where we're going with this. We need to get A alone. So let's go ahead and move all of the constants to the right and leave the variables, or move the variables to the left-hand side. Remember, anytime you move a term to the other side of an equation or an inequality, in this case we're dealing with an inequality, you need to make sure that you change the sign, because you're really using the addition property of equality. So a -2 on the left is actually a +2 on the right. Again, let's keep cleaning up our equation. On the right-hand side, group together the -12, the 2, and the 7, which gives us -3. Last and finally, we need to get A alone. We don't want -1A or -A. We want A. Let's divide both sides by -1. And, drum roll please, A is good, less than 3. Because whenever you divide both sides by a negative, the inequality sign flips. And yay, we're done! But no, we're not. This is where a lot of people stopped because they didn't go back and read the problem. It says determine the largest integer value of A. All right, well, whenever we're dealing with an inequality, we don't typically just have one answer. We have multiple answers. So if A is less than 3, let's list off all of the numbers that A could be. The integers, positive and negative whole numbers, no fractions or decimals allowed. So A is smaller than 3. Well, 3 is not smaller than 3, but 2 is, 1 is, 0 is, -1 is, and so on and so forth. I want the largest one, so my final answer, A, is 2. Question 28 is talking to us about the vertex, the turning point of this parabola. And it gives you the coordinates, but this is all information that you should be able to identify, just if you graph it. And let's go ahead and do that. So here you have it. I graphed it, and of course, graphing and looking at the table of values go hand in hand. There's our vertex. Again, we can see a vertex because all of the y values on the opposite sides will match up. That's what creates that nice pretty U shape. All right, let's read on. So it says, find the coordinates of the vertex of the parabola defined by this crazy business here. Well, it's not that crazy because we've talked so much about shifting functions this year. We need to think about, where is the -2? Is it inside? Is it the outside of the parentheses? Is it in front of the function? Well, it's inside. So whenever you see a -2 on the inside, that means that our function is going to move 2 to the right. Good, because it always does the opposite of what you think when it's inside the parentheses. So there's my vertex right here, and move that vertex over to the right, which will be right there. That new point has the coordinates of 4, -2. Let's go ahead now and summarize this in words. The vertex of g of x is 4, -2, because the parabola f of x was shifted 2 units to the right. And remember, we have to write this out in words because it says explain.